Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here this morning, or it's morning here. I guess it's afternoon over there. I'm pleased to moderate the first panel. The panel is on climate change and economic dynamism, innovation for economic and planetary security. And we have two excellent speakers today, each of which will talk for about 10 minutes so that we can leave 10 minutes for question and answer. So as you hear them speaking, please send in questions which we can then discuss at the end of it. So I will introduce the first speaker, who is Professor Rick van der Ploeg from Oxford University. Rick, you have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much for inviting me to come to talk at this symposium. I will open my slides. So most economies, so it's all about industrial policy and the new green policy. I will end there, but I will start with what economists normally say, and that is the golden policy is to price carbon. And it's surprising how little it's done in the global economy. So it has many advantages to price carbon. The things we think of at first is, of course, to reduce demand. You put on an extra jumper, you put the heating low, you take a bicycle, all kinds of things you can do. Maybe substitute to cleaner kind of energies, whether it's renewable or maybe gas rather than coal. But what's often forgotten is that carbon pricing also has excellent effects on supply. It is the golden way to encourage the sheikhs and others to leave oil, the coal and the gas in the ground. And that's really what's needed. The green transition means that we have plenty of the stuff. We have plenty of coal, we have plenty of oil, we have plenty of gas. But if we want to limit global warming to maybe 2 or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times, we have to leave the stuff in the ground. Without a carbon price, we would not have not enough incentives to have green R&D. So you want more green research and development. We'll talk more about it when we talk about industrial policy, and that's absolutely crucial. It's actually also the case if you want to, it's absolutely essential to get the net zero targets, which all countries have committed to, is that we also have to capture the stuff, to capture the CO2 and sequester it in the ground. And markets for that won't arise until you price carbon. So, but we need, of course, as the keynote has already said, we need supplementary policies. One of them is we want to avoid Macron's fate of the yellow vests. We want to use some of the revenue to make it politically acceptable. So that's to give some of the money to the lower incomes, to give some of the money to firms that are hurt most. Very importantly, we have something called Swanson's law. Here it is. And it shows that for every doubling of solar panels in use, that the costs of solar panels drop by about 20%. The same pictures I can give you for batteries, or I can give you for windmills and things like that. So the idea is that every doubling of use of renewable energy will lead to cost reduction between 20 and 40%. So these are not internalized by the market. So there is a case to supplement carbon pricing with subsidies for renewable energy. Of course, there is another argument, and that's been basically argued by Daron Acemoglu from MIT. And he says, well, you have to take the whole economy, and Philippe Aghion as well, and shift it from one direction, carbon intensive direction, into a green direction. You want to redirect technical change. So they're arguing for temporary spikes for green R&D, particularly if these patent markets may not work very well. But again, that's as a supplement to a more slowly rising carbon price. We need soft finance to overcome capital market failure, because many of these new firms are the ones doing the green transition, and they may not have good access to capital markets. We need a new industrial policy for innovation, and indeed, has already been said, for exploiting increased returns to scale. And of course, it's no surprise to say this in Japan. We need much more. All that I've spoken to so far is about mitigation of emissions, but we need a lot of work on adaptation as well. So Japan and the Netherlands have that in common. So we need more work on dikes and things like that. So, but really, very little has been achieved. We've agreed on net zero by 2050, with global emissions have and are still rising relentlessly at about 2.6% per year. So Nordhaus once put us all, Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize for the climate, and he said there's very, very little carbon pricing. If you look at the World Bank database, the average price for carbon is about $2 per ton of CO2. It should be about 40 times higher. And the reason is that these carbon prices have very little coverage. Many of the biggest polluters are exempted from carbon pricing. So many say, if you say steel or aluminum or cement, many countries or many regions of the world, they're actually excluded from carbon pricing if there are carbon pricing schemes at all. Some of us are old enough to remember all the Kyoto agreements, and we're also old enough to remember that they completely collapsed. So international climate policy is at that end. And when we look at the data, we say rather than pricing carbon, we see huge fossil fuel subsidies in the global economy. So rather than pricing it, we're subsidizing it. And that's particularly for coal. The subsidies have been calculated by the IMF to be between 6 and 7% of global GDP. That's a lot. That's big potatoes. And it completely dwarfs any little initiatives for carbon pricing. And we see the same thing, that we should have lots of investments in green technology. It's a kind of a double externality, global warming and learning by doing. But there is almost no subsidies for green technology. There's a lot of the subsidies go for the old industries, say sometimes aerospace, sometimes defense, but not enough to the green stuff. So we need more on that. And that's indeed essential for a green, new green industrial policy. So what we need to do very quickly, we need to get rid immediately of all these fossil fuel subsidies. We need immediate moratorium on coal. Maybe also a moratorium on things like diesel cars or petrol cars as early as possible, at the latest from 2030 onwards. Start with a clear signal, start pricing carbon and let it rise at about 3.5% per year. Some countries are already getting close to it, like the ones I just mentioned. If necessary, you do it on top of European permit schemes. You could argue as a politician that carbon pricing has collateral benefits. The problem is then that you get then less air pollution, and that's very heavy in some cities, and these are local benefits. They don't suffer from international free rider problems. We need to do these things, and Europe has made big progress on that, to avoid dirty imports coming when you price carbon from abroad. You need border tax adjustments, and the European Parliament has made excellent progress on that. And we need, in a sense, a climate wall around Europe to make sure that we have a level playing field. Then we need to subsidize the green energies, to internalize learning by doing, and we subsidize green R&D to get these, to redirect technical change. And we should realize that I haven't got time to do the numbers, but each year delay, each month delay, just like with the vaccines and with the COVID, every time you wait, it makes realizing our climate targets very much more costly. And it doesn't go up linearly, it goes up very non-linearly, it goes up much more steeply. So I was asked to say something about the pandemic. Well, as we know, and many of you know much more about it than me, it's had surprisingly little effect on economic activity. Of course, it's had an effect, but I must admit, I thought it would have had much more effects before the pandemic, but it had huge effects on inequality. Elderly, people with poor health, but people with low financial buffers, those in vulnerable professions are hit most. But we can learn something. So they did kind of a vaccine race. And then within a year, we had a whole lot of vaccines, and then the whole world got, well, they got injected, and it helped to turn the pandemic. Could we not use a similar model on a global scale, on a national scale, and have a green technology race, where governments together with business corporations cooperating internationally set up a race for 4 or 5, 6, the low-hanging fruit in terms of green technologies, and try to then engender a green technological progress. Maybe not within a year, but say within the next 5 years. And who knows, some of these pie-in-the-sky technologies then become technologies we can actually use. So that's something I would think that's an essential part of a new industrial policy. It's not really a part of the big European plan for climate put forward by Frans Timmermans, but it should have been, I feel. So then there are lots of other things. The next session will be about supply chain. that we need to come to a resilient economy. We should think of more supply chains which are not only resilient for pandemics and for terrorism, but also resilient for in a world of climate change. So I won't go for all of them, but maybe create an army of zero carbon workers. We need to retrain and redeploy those who can't work into the different industries, from home installation to wind turbine manufacture to tree planting. So this is, we need a whole green revolution. We should not keep living zombies alive, the living zombies from the fossil theory alive. We should keep them only alive if they manage to change. So if steel factories are really using green hydrogen on a big scale, building lots of windmills, make hydrogen, use a steel factory. So maybe steel factories close to seas are better able to do that, then it's possible. But to subsidize the living zombies, which has been happening too much in the past, it's just crazy. People always say never waste a crisis. We should use it to accelerate the green transition. So there's this big problem that the fossil fuel incumbents might try to frustrate green plans. So just to kind of end with a few things. So there are great books which are not by, well, they're by economists, but more by business people. And I want to mention like Bill Gates, Mariana Mazzucato, and Rebecca Henderson. So these are business school books, if you want, maybe being a bit impolite, but that's what they are. But they do make a case for a big role for corporations and capitalism to play a role. It's not something we can just do top down. That's why I'm so happy with the new institute that's now being started in Japan, which you just told me about. So for example, Rebecca talks about a triple crisis, environmental inequality, collapse of institutions and threat to democracy, and the need for purpose-driven firms, the need to rebuild institutions to bring markets and government back in balance. And that all of that is necessary to get that crucial innovation necessary. The CPR has been in the forefront, together with, particularly led by Lucrezia Reichlin, to establish metrics, the carbon accounting, to measure environmental and social impact of carbon business practices. If we can't measure it, then we can't even do policy. And we need more cooperation on sustainable self-regulatory standards across whole industries. Mariana Mazzucato, her book is about the role of government and corporations. It reminds me very much of the old books by Stuart Holland, but she's really making, it's really very similar, that the government and corporations should together, maybe at a global level, try to solve these big planetary problems. And I think she's right. And she's very popular. You can criticize her books maybe for some reason, but the grand idea, I think, makes sense. So Bill Gates, again, he emphasizes that we need people like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, particularly the best example and perhaps most unknown example is Norman Borlaug. So he was the kind of invented semi-dwarf beat, and he made possible the green revolution. And that really lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I come now with my last two slides, and they're on radical climate policies. So people like some of the best people in our profession. So I think in Europe, perhaps especially in person, are the best, two of the best economists we have in Europe. And they're starting to think about it, that preferences are no longer fixed. Economists had this obsession that preferences are axiomatic and they're fixed, but people can change preferences. So the idea is a bit, as more and more people are green, then more people will be before brown, they will turn green too. So and then the idea is that because you have these chicken and egg externalities, so for example, the demand for green technology, say for batteries, or depends on low-cost products being available. But the supply of such cheap products only because available there is enough demand. And it's these strategic complementarities that lead to multiple outcomes. And then they also make the case that the political system cannot commit to future policy, and that leads to a climate trap. So you get the society gets stuck in an equilibrium with too high emissions. So also they make the case that you need a grand coalition of visionary politicians, business leaders, and people in society to shift from the bad to good equilibrium. So this is my last slide, and this is on work I'm doing with Tony Venables for the World Bank. And this is need for radical climate policy. We all know about climate tipping points, like Greenland melting, Antarctic ice sheet melting, the permafrost melting, the reversal of the Gulf Stream. These are all relatively long time scales, maybe from 50 years to hundreds and thousands of years. But say, let's use that same type of idea now to to kind of use non-climatic tipping points to get to really rapid green transition. So the type of things we could think of are technological tipping points. So once the cost of solar or wind plus storage is loaded of coal or gas, it will just go flip very quickly. It will flip very, very quickly. Social tipping points. So think of Greta Thunberg, but if enough people become green, more and more people become green, and it can certainly go very rapidly. So we should see, for example, we had thousands of years of food binding of young females in China. And then within a couple of decades, that changed. And then thirdly, political tipping points. What kind of international mechanisms can we do so that if one country becomes green, that other countries will follow more and more quickly? So we thought about climate clubs and others. But basically, you need genuine leadership across policy corporations. So I conclude with mankind has always been inventive and it will rise to the challenge again. But we mustn't wait long because it becomes much, much costlier for every year we wait. And then it might be too late because these climatic tipping points lead to abrupt and irreversible changes, and we want to avoid those at all costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rick. I appreciate those comments, and I'll order a couple of those books and read them more closely. Thank you very much on that. I really like the idea of a socioeconomic tipping point, not just scientific points. And us as social scientists studying that, I think that was a really important point. The next speaker is a young entrepreneur trying to do exactly what you were talking about, Rick. Our next speaker is Yuki Ono, who's a representative of Hachidori Denryoku, Borderless Japan. Miss Ono, are you on here? Let me see, Adam.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, here we go. All right, please. You have 10 minutes. Looking forward to your comments.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting this symposium. My name is Yuki Ono. I'm representative Hachidori Denryoku now. So, okay, before I explain Hachidori Denryoku, I would like to explain few data of global warming. This chart shows that carbon dioxide concentration over 800,000 years. Carbon dioxide concentration is measured in ppm. The carbon dioxide concentration follows same cycle every 100,000 years. The time where the ppm is lowest is called ice age, and this age is 180 ppm. And according to this data, the most comfortable ppm for human is 280 ppm. But after 1950, we burned fossil fuel to make energy. As a result, like this. In 2019, that degree of ppm reached over 400. 400. Oh, yes. Carbon dioxide concentration increased 40% compared to before industrial revolution. Carbon dioxide concentration correlate with global temperature. And this video was made by NASA. It is showing the change of global temperature from 1966 to 2000. And the global temperature has cycle like carbon dioxide concentration. Repeat getting warm and getting cold. But after 1970, it's get warmer and warmer, like almost red color. And so what can we do for global warming? According to IPCC, if we took the action truly, we can prevent the temperature from rising more than 1.7 degree in 2100. But if we didn't take action enough, then temperature increase 4.5 degree. Now we try to keep it within 1.5 degree in 2100. And there is one more fact for global warming. We must achieve 2 milestones. It is said that to prevent global warming, we must reduce emission of greenhouse gases by at least 50% from 2010 level until 2030. And by 2050, also we must realize zero emission of greenhouse gases. If we can't achieve any one of these, there is no turning back. The global warming is going to speed up. So how are the energy and the global warming related? In Japan, thermal power accounts for 75% of power generation. On the other hand, renewable energy shares only 22%. The usage of renewable energy is lowest than a lot of countries, as this graph shows. As a result, energy is the biggest sector of CO2 emission in Japan. According to this chart, it consists of about 40%. And also at home, the biggest sector of CO2 emission is energy. It is about 45%. There are many ways that we can take action for global warming, but the way which has the biggest impact is to switch from thermal power to renewable energy. So that I start Hachidori Denryoku. So Hachidori Denryoku has 3 features. Feature 1, do not emit CO2, only renewable energy, 100%. And feature 2, use 1% of electricity cost for construction new renewable energy power plant. And feature 3, use another 1% for supporting social activities. So let's explain more details. Firstly, we prepare only one plan. I mean, not price plan. This is about energy mix. The plan is renewable energy 100%. And in Japan, there are over 500 energy companies now. But the number of companies that have 100% renewable energy plan is less than 30. And also the number of companies that has only 100% renewable energy plan is just 2 or 3. Why? Because increase the cost than thermal power. But for stopping global warming, we need to increase renewable energy. So decided to use the energy mix, 100% renewable energy. And our energy mix in fiscal 2020 is like that. So solar power 60% and the wind power 31%, and small hydro power 9%. And secondly, using 1% of electricity cost for construction new renewable energy power plant. We have already constructed the first renewable energy plant in Chiba Prefecture. The name of plant is Soil and Sun because it is solar sharing. Solar sharing means this is construct solar panels above the farm and get the sunlight only 30% for generation electricity. Also, we try to do farming with the same way of low impact of the environment. We do no-till farming because the soil, the good soil can store the carbon. So do not tilling. Then we try to maximize storage rate of carbon. And people can support social activities by using electricity. We categorize 11 categories like international support or LGBT or animal welfare, education, like that. And after applying that form, they can choose activities they would like to support or just choose category. If people cannot choose specific activities, they can choose all group also. And they can support 1% of electricity cost every month. And they receive the report that how helpful these donations for solving social problems from activities. And even if it is good for solving global warming, people do not choose high cost. So we set the price lower than local major energy companies' standard plan. Like the price plan, like minus 1%, minus 1.5%, minus 2.5%, like that, a little bit lower than standard big company, major company. And the electricity is invisible, and there's no difference if you use thermal power or renewable energy. But I would like them to realize how much impact they have for global warming to switch the electricity. So we try to tell them with this bill. Everyone looks this bill absolutely. So we add the information of 1% price every month, how much, and also contribution for stopping global warming. This month of reducing CO2, this month compared with using thermal power, and make sure it has same effective for how many trees you plant. Many people post this bill to SNS. Hachidori Denryoku spread word of mouth. At the end, I would like to show one story. This is called Krikindi, the golden hummingbird. This story, the forest was on fire. And all of the animals, insects, and the birds in the forest rushed to escape. But there was one little hummingbird named Krikindi, or golden bird, who stayed behind. This little bird went back and forth between water and the fire, and dropping a single drop of water from its beak onto the fire below. When the animals saw this, they began to laugh and at Krikindi. Why are you doing that? They asked. And Krikindi replied, I am only doing what I can do. So I want to say that move society with your single drop of water, and change the world with our single drop of water. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that inspirational story. I hope we can all do what we can. And also very much like what you're doing, because we can't rely on charity and good feelings to make the climate transition. Somebody has to make a business out of it. Somebody has to do something. And I really appreciate what you're doing there. So we have a few minutes for a Q&A here. And I want to start out posing a quick background question to Rick. Rick, would you say that climate change is really a problem of too much heat and too much seawater and too little fresh water? Or is that too simplistic?
It is definitely simplistic. There are obviously connections, because with the heating of the ice melts, seawater will rise. The time that takes is very long. So you remember those films by Al Gore, there was no more Holland, no more Ireland. The Ireland States is quick, but for like Europe, we're not talking about 10 or 20 years, talking more like a century or even more. But of course, the global warming will affect particularly the developing countries. So we have a historical, and they will have less crops. The people will be migrating. A lot of them may migrate to more northern lying countries, and there are huge costs associated with that. We can manage those costs, but there are costs, but the costs fall very unequally. They really fall more on developing countries who actually have the least emissions and suffer the most from global warming. So there's a huge moral. So the reason why I say it's more complicated, yes, it is in the simple as you say, but the complication is there is also a huge moral dilemma.
Thank you very much. My next question is from the audience to Ms. Ono. It's question number 3. You can see that on your screen, Yuki. In Japan, there's a big earthquake in the Toku region last week, and many power plants were shut down. There's been a power crunch alert issued yesterday. Can Hachidori electric power provide stable supply of energy even in such situations? Could you please answer that?
Okay, yes. I mean, no, we cannot supply energy stable yet, I think. But the renewable energy has potential to do, because there's that is not affected by market condition, and there is only 22% share in Japan now, so there is a potential more, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that part of the diversity and resilience is diversifying energy sources. So even apart from the climate things, having a range of diverse sources is good for the Japanese economy. So Rick, I'm going to pose to a sort of the big question. All of us have been reading this terrible news about the war in Ukraine. Do you think these tensions or war, Russia, potentially China, the energy shock, is this helping or hurting the fight for climate change in, let's say, the next few years?
Well, I mean, so let's first say that, I mean, my biggest worry is about what's happening in Ukraine. I have many friends there. I'm also not happy about many people in Russia, scientists who feel terrible what their country is doing. But putting that aside, let's look on the energy aspects. We see, of course, that the bans on Russian gas and on, you know, basically the whole war has pushed up gas prices and led to a huge cost of living crisis. That would, of course, be a huge incentive for people to use less gas and to use less fossil fuel and move the speed up the green transition. So that would be fantastic. So what are governments doing? Whether it's Sweden or whether it's Denmark or whether it's the Netherlands or France, they're all kind of lowering gas prices one way or the other, either lowering the VAT on it, lowering some excises on it. They say it's temporary, but really doing the wrong thing. In a sense, as you could argue that it's a subsidy for the Russian war machine. You're basically giving money straight to Putin. So I think the best thing is to help the people who suffer from a cost of living crisis by giving them just simple transfers, but not to lower gases, just to give people money which they then can spend, but not destroy the incentive. So again, out of this disastrous period in our life, I would never have thought it would have happened during my lifetime, but now it's here. We should use this whole crisis to speed up the green transition. But we should, of course, help those people who are hurt most by it, but not by lowering gas prices, but by giving them cash transfers. You're muted.
What I had in mind was I've seen that some countries are taking this as an opportunity to go back to coal and have coal as a backup and thereby sustaining this extremely dirty way. Yeah. So in the balance of, what would you say?
So I think it's an extremely good point. I had huge arguments with other environmental economists about it, but it's clear that if you ban Russian gas and Russian oil, and that you need to kind of nuclear energy, everybody is saying, and I'm not so much in favor, but you can't suddenly, push out nuclear energy. It takes long investments. You're talking about 20, 30 years down the road. So then in the short run, the only thing you can do is have a temporary blip in coal, particularly because a lot of the renewable energy is intermittent anyway. So there's a coal backup anyway. All countries have a coal backup for if the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. So I see that during this period, people will rely on coal a bit. That's bad for green in the short run, but it may be good in the longer run if you then hasten the green transition as well. It's a temporary spike in coal to overcome this problem.
Thank you. I think I would point out as well that this shock, I mean, of course, we've seen energy shocks before, but this came out of nowhere and is having a national impact. could lead to changes in governments, this cost of living. And so I think that is going to push governments into reducing their reliance on imported oil and gas in a sort of longer term, or at least building up stocks, because this is a wake-up call that the world we lived in, where we could rely on these supplies, is potentially leaving for the long term. So I'm hopeful that the shock element, the variance, will lead to it.
So what do we need in, for example, Europe, which I know a bit better, is that, for example, some countries are completely stuck, like Germany, because they said no to nuclear, they said, and they said no to coal, and now they say no to Russian gas. So what do they do? So what's needed in Europe? We need huge interconnector investments. People haven't thought about this. So like in Spain is, for example, extremely good for solar energy. But then how do you make hydrogen there, and how do you transport it to where the energy is needed? That hasn't really been thought out at all. I see also a question about negative emissions. I cannot emphasize it enough. All the IPCC scenarios rely on negative emissions. So they rely on CO2 capture. That's a technology which is ready in the laboratory, ready in small scale things, but it's not cost effective yet. So we need a huge push on technological innovation to make these negative emissions possible. They've already been calculated in, but they haven't emerged yet in the market yet.
Thank you. My next question is for Yuki. This is question number 2, as you can see it on the screen in the chat. So energy is a huge equipment industry. In other words, it involves huge investments. And we saw some pictures of some of the investments you're doing. And the question is, where have you gotten so far? And when do you expect to be in the black, which is always a question for startups. When are you actually going to start making money? Yuki, please.
I agree. It's difficult for ventures because of money, but exactly, I have no idea because of Russian. But we will investment for renewable energy plant more and try to get energy which is not affected by market condition. So that is the way to be in black, I think.
Thank you. And let me do a follow-up question. So one of the audience, this is question number 6 in the chat, if you want to read it. It's great to see CO2 reduction on the electricity bill. Do they receive a report of how the 1% was actually used, but which social problem, and also which social problem is the most popular among your clients?
Okay, the most popular program is the education in Japan. I mean, poor children education, or helping. I'm sorry, I'm not
well, that's okay. I think that was the key question. Do you find, is this when you communicate with your clients and customers, this kind of letting people know that their money is doing good? Do you find that an effective way? Is that part of your, yes?
Yes. I think they seem happy to know how use their money to helping people, and they also how people's situation change, how means affected by their money. It is happy to make them, I think.
Right. I absolutely love the hummingbird thing. You know, if you can get 50 million hummingbirds in Japan, it might be able to put out some fires. So there you go. Appreciate that. Now, Rick, you have a couple of the classic questions in climate change. In other words, who's going to pay for it? And you might also touch on who should pay for it. And if you will, I can add on this idea of, in a market economy, when a transaction takes place, so for example, somebody burns diesel fuel, that's partly a supply issue and partly a demand issue, but who's responsible for burning that? The supplier, in other words, the producer, or the consumer? So if you could talk about, you know, who should pay for this climate damage and mitigation going forward, with those thoughts in mind, please.
The first point to make is that, of course, that carbon pricing is not about getting money out of the pockets of people, because the idea is that you rebate the money back to the economy. So the whole thing is that's often forgotten by politicians, often forgotten by commentators, that carbon pricing is not a way to raise revenue. It's just a way to change relative prices to make it more attractive to be green. But of course, we must realize that we need green industrial policy, and that'll cost. So for example, looking at households first, and then we look at industry. If you have to move to a heat pump, that may cost $20,000, $30,000 per house, maybe even more, depending on the type of house. You can't expect low-income households to finance that. So I think you will have to make a mixture of subsidies and a mixture of soft finance to make possible those investments to make say houses green. The same thing for cars. Many people still drive very old cars, particularly poorer people. So people who've done research into that say you might actually want to have some scrapping subsidies, which will be paid all by us, to just take the dirtiest cars off the road as quick as possible. And then, of course, but if you look at corporations, if you look at a cement or aluminium or say steel factory, they will have to switch to solar or wind energy. That's not very good for them because it's intermittent. So they need to have some backup storage stuff. And of course, in Iceland, you can do it by, you have geothermal, you have hydropower, but most of the people are nowadays thinking of green hydrogen. So you make green hydrogen from wind power and try to do it. So then there's again a question, who should pay that? So of course, if you look at these plans in Europe, it's the government seem to be, to my surprise, very willing to pay it. So this is extremely susceptible to lobby groups. So I really see the sirens of many lobbies where people try to get the government to pay almost too much, whereas normally some of it is just normal business risk. So you really should not be subsidizing the old guys who are brown to become green, because maybe there are other ways of doing it. But anyway, that's a big political debate. There's, I think, that people now they've moved, after the Green Ideal. Many governments are basically saying, well, we'll help you do this green transition to business corporations. And it should be, of course, a sharing of those costs. So otherwise, those bills, for example, for the European one, if you really do the cost analysis for the bills suggested by Frans Timmermans' report, which is great, it's going to be colossal. And that will lead to political backlash as well. So that's the big political question, which still needs to be answered. The subsidies for R&D and for green technologies are meant to be temporary for 10, 15 years to get people across. That's also the idea of these radical climate policies. You get people from a bad equilibrium to a good equilibrium. So the idea is that after 5, 6, 7 years, you can take them off. So it should be a temporary cost. And then if you think to the total cost, we think that maybe 1%, if you're really pessimistic, maybe at most 2% of GDP would be the cost. And so it will be comparable, say, to the cost maybe of the pandemic. So to do the green transition. So I think there's every reason to just do it.
Right. Thank you. What I was hoping you'd touch on is this climate justice point, that the climate half-life of carbon in the air is about 50 years. Much of it, the stock, was put in there by rich countries getting rich. Yep. And now we're talking about poor countries not getting rich, at least the old way, because we put all the carbon in the air. My generation and my kind of country did it. And we're asking them
it's
to
absolutely
pay.
correct. So there's two parts of the climate justice. The point you just made, that we have a historical debt. We were allowed to do all these emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now we're telling developing countries you can't do it. And secondly, it's particularly bad as a climate justice point because they suffer the cost more than we do. So this really requires two things. One, it requires huge transfers from rich countries to poor countries, which are not forthcoming at these international summits, to actually almost make it attractive for them to make a green transition. And secondly, it requires big transfers of green technology, again, towards developing countries to help them to make that green transition. Although it's on the radar of some capitalist philanthropes like Bill Gates and other people like that. It's not enough yet on the radar of kind of governments, I think, in the West, that we need something there as well to kind of, otherwise, what's the point if India keeps on using coal and Africa stays on the old model, where they should go on the new model, they should go on the transition. And we may benefit much more from that than having a few marginal reductions at home. So there's a huge, that's the moral aspect. There's a moral justice argument for doing that. And that's snowed under. I mean, I think that you could be terribly disappointed about the outcomes of the national negotiations, particularly on that front.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to shift to Yuki a little bit and go to the generational issue. Since you're the only young person on the screen, and Rick and I won't be around to see 2100, what it'll look like, but you probably will. And so I wonder of a generational thing. And in Japan, do you find that there's a big pattern between a generational attitude towards climate change, or do you think it's been sweeping the society as a whole? I mean, it's a vague question, but if you could even speak from a personal perspective, do you find young people are more open to your hummingbird story than older people in Japan?
Yes, I think yes. But like younger people know and study in school about global warming, so they know that how we should action more or like that. So they understand and take action more. But also older people a little bit will change now, I think, because they sometimes they use Hachidori Denryoku energy, and they said they know from children or grandchildren. They told to grandmother, and they change the power. So a little bit they change more and more because of younger generation, I think.
There's an extra issue that people like Larry Kotlikoff is making. That of course, there's older people like Richard and me, there's young people like you, and there are lots of people still to be born in the future. And the argument has been that if you want to have an intergenerational win-win situation, that all generations are better off. That maybe those people to be born need to pay money to people who are currently alive to make that green transition possible. And that you do that by these intergenerational transfers by running up debt a bit. And the amazing thing is that it's possible to find transfer schemes whereby all generations get better off and all countries get better off. And I never thought it would be possible, but now we've done that for about 80 countries, 50 generations. So it is possible under the right transfers to actually make everybody better off, and particularly also make the climate better off. So maybe that's what we need to look at. But I think you're right that a lot of the action is coming now from younger people. But there are, of course, even younger people, but we still have to be born. We have to consider those as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But if I could just close with a little reflection on the generational thing. I live in a multi-generational household. The grandparents of my kids grew up in World War II and the post-war period, and they changed the world. So here in Europe, France and Germany, every generation fought a horrible war with each other, and that was just the way it was. And their generation said, no, we're going to change it. They set up the European Union, all the international organizations. And after a while, it became very good economic growth, but they were used to making huge sacrifices for a better world. And I think they understood that they really needed to do something differently. Now, the next generation, say my parents, grew up in a world where everything was really pretty good. It was growing fast. I mean, of course, there's inequality, and I'm talking about people in the rich countries, but they took as granted the generation which completely changed global governance and the way we did things. And so I think it's not just the young people, but also the generation, the post-war generation who understood you can change the world as it is. And I think that would be a powerful thing. So with that, I am going to close so that we don't go over in this, so we have another panel coming. But I would like to give both of you 1 or 2 minutes if you want to send out, maybe you could send out another hummingbird story, or Rick, you want to say one message. So let me start with Yuki. Why don't you, if you want to say 1 or 2 words to the audience about the green.
Okay, just simple word. Please do what you can do. Only that things. And it change the world with everyone. That's it. A simple message.
Thank you very much. Very powerful, very simple. I hope you're our next Greta Thunberg, the Greta Thunberg of Japan.
Yeah.
So Rick, what would be your
So
word?
I can only agree on that. So I think the conventional policies like green R&D subsidies, adaptation subsidies, carbon pricing will not be enough. We need these radical policies. So to make sure that everybody gets involved, that you get these flywheel effects, these roll-on effects, and it can be in technology, socially, as you said, that more people just start. Every hummingbird counts, and also politically, every country counts as well. So we're beginning to think more about policies that you can do to kind of encourage these kind of flywheel effects. And so I'm very much on the same page as you, and I think that's really what we need. And then I hope the transition can be very quick, and it has to be quick because the clock is ticking. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Let me give everybody, I think we ought to clap, even though nobody can hear us, for the great panelists that we had. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to the moderator of the whole seminar. And I'll stop right there. Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yuki.